the brand has gotten so strong that we're watching Amazon Basics dominate and actually take over from some of the other brands. So in apparel, in home, like bedding and things like that, it seems like they're gradually shifting the focus to Amazon Basics and then in baby care, Amazon Elements, because they're realizing the Amazon brand itself has a lot of credibility and trust from their customers.
This is the E-commerce Braintrust, a podcast about building momentum online for established consumer brands. Join our hosts and their expert guests for high-level conversations about e-commerce strategies, trends, and innovations. Access our Braintrust and boost your brand's e-commerce potential.
Hello and welcome to the E-commerce Braintrust podcast. I'm your host, Kiri Masters, and I'm joined by your co-host, Julie Spear.
Hi, Kiri.
So today on the show, we have a special guest, Danny Clavis from Clavis Insight. And I was really glad to get Danny on the podcast because he's a real wealth of knowledge around the retail space and digital. And what Danny explains what Clavis does, but what they do is collect a lot of data and insights for large brands and retailers to feed back into their product assortment decisions, which marketplaces they should be on, helping to contribute to their strategic plans around assortment and distribution channels. And so he was a really great person to talk with about how Amazon is getting into the game of launching their own private labels. And some of the most popular products on Amazon today are actually manufactured and branded with Amazon, either the Amazon brand or a private label brand. And so this has been a phenomenon that has been understandably a little concerning for some national brands in terms of Amazon is a channel that they sell on and also now a competitor for some of their products. So Julie, before we get into the interview, is there anything that you want to prime our listeners to listen out to that you thought was a particularly interesting point? We'll circle back at the end of the interview, but what was an observation from your side?
I think that there are two areas that really caught my attention was when Danny went into detail about the threats that Amazon's private labels now pose and kind of how that's evolved a little bit over time. And then getting into, how brands can actually manage those threats and respond to those threats. So those were the 2 points that jumped out at me. And I would say pay close attention to the threats parts of today's interview.
Sounds good. Well, we'll jump into the interview and then Julie and I will come back at the end to give our insights and takeaways. So I have Danny with us today, Danny from Clavis Insight. And Danny, instead of me sort of reading out the official bio that I found about you on the internet, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do about Clavis Insight as well and how you work with brands?
Sure. So I'm Chief Marketing Officer here at Clavis Insight. I've been with Clavis for about 4 years, and I've been in a range of roles, including professional services, customer success, product management, and so on. Clavis Insight was actually just acquired by Essential PLC just before Christmas. And in that process, we are joining with One Click Retail, who is another Essential brand, to create an even broader set of e-commerce insights for brand manufacturers. I'll come back to that in just a moment, but by way of my background, prior to Clavis, I was with Catapult Ecommerce, where I was leading e-commerce insight strategy and sales for a number of branded manufacturers. And then before that, I was with Johnson & Johnson for 8 years. And my last few years there were spent building our e-commerce capability, calling on Amazon, both in the US and globally. So I've been focused on e-commerce for a number of years. It's definitely a passion for me, and Amazon probably at the fore of that area of passion.
It runs thick in your blood.
Exactly. And then as we think about Clavis and One Click, what we're doing is providing the insights and analytics that branded manufacturers need to get more insight into how to improve their online sales and performance. Fundamentally, if you're selling to Amazon as a vendor through Vendor Central, you don't have direct access to your listings or your sales and share. And so both One Click and Clavis are here to bring more visibility and insight to manufacturers so that they understand their sales and share relative to their categories. They understand things like in-stocks, ratings and reviews, content, and a whole range of other analytics that go well beyond what's available in Vendor Central.
Right. Yeah, that is a major pain point for vendors that we work with at Bobsled Marketing, because there isn't enough data to figure out those kind of metrics that you mentioned.
Exactly. And Amazon's just upgraded Vendor Central, and it's certainly a better interface, and there's some good and new insights in there. But at the end of the day, Amazon's rightfully focused on their customers first, and vendor analytics isn't at the fore of their concern, and probably not in their interest, because it's better to control the information. So we're just helping manufacturers have better insight, and ultimately it helps them work more effectively with Amazon and other retailers, because they're bringing those insights that go beyond what they would otherwise have access to.
Right. And are you familiar with Amazon's premium retail analytics suite, which is an additional paid, right? So the insights that you're able to gather go above and beyond that, because you're actually looking at competitor or category information. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, exactly. So on the sales and share side, that's based on proprietary calculations based on a number of different demand signals and data inputs to estimate sales, not only for the manufacturer, but for their competitors as well. On the digital shelf side, where Clavis has historically focused, we're scraping retailer sites and pulling information from there. So it's more comprehensive than what you would otherwise get. But more importantly, it's positioned and structured the way manufacturers are accustomed to looking at the insights, and it makes it more actionable for them. So as a primary example, Amazon has their own categorization structure. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes there's some noise in there. The first thing we do is we take the data in and reorganize it according to the manufacturer's hierarchy, which is how they're used to looking at their categories, subcategories, and brands.
Right. So you're going to be a wealth of knowledge here, Danny, in the topic that we have today, which is how can national brands compete with Amazon's private label brands? And so Amazon has brought out, I guess slowly at first, my recollection is around 2016-ish was when they first started bringing out private label brands to the public's knowledge, at least. And since then, they have released so many new private label brands in apparel and fashion, home goods, baby products, battery. I think Amazon's batteries are the number one top selling product on Amazon. Yeah, this whole basics line. And so it kind of has it's a little bit of a threat to national brands who are often selling on Amazon themselves. Like you mentioned, all the data that Amazon has, they're usually fairly unwilling to share that with vendors and sellers on Amazon. But what they can do is collect all that data and use it for their own product development. So I can definitely see how national brands have a love-hate relationship with Amazon, because while it does bring a lot of traffic and awareness to their products, which they might not have otherwise had, or just, that simplicity of being able to order with Amazon Prime, and in some cases get it within 2 hours of ordering a product. That's something that very few other companies can deal with. But it really is a bit of a hotbed of potentially your proprietary sales information getting into the hands of someone who is a competitor at the end of the day.
Yep. The reality of it is that's actually a dynamic most manufacturers in the brick and mortar world have long dealt with. They've always known that ultimately if they're selling on to Walmart, CVS, really any retailer who has their own house brands, the retailer has access to their own data plus the manufacturers, and often use that both to enhance their margin, but also a number of retailers will practice running private label promotions in parallel to the manufacturer's promotions and so on. So that private label competitor piece is somewhat familiar to more legacy manufacturers. I see, really two interesting additional threats that come as a result of Amazon's particular brand. So one is, for a number of years, they had 5 or 6 house brands like Pinzon, Larkin Row, and others, and more recently Wickedly Prime and Mama Bear, that weren't overtly Amazon brands. And when they first started Amazon Basics a few years ago, it was like, okay, batteries, headphones, I get it. But I could never imagine Amazon, the name, being on my food or my diapers for my babies, right? But the brand has gotten so strong that we're watching Amazon Basics dominate and actually take over from some of the other brands. So in apparel, in home, like bedding and things like that, it seems like they're gradually shifting the focus to Amazon basics and then in baby care, Amazon elements, because they're realizing the Amazon brand itself has a lot of credibility and trust from their customers.
Yep.
That's concerning. It's our estimates as Amazon basics in total did over $400 million in revenue last year, growing 10% year on year fairly steadily. And then the other piece of that is to the point that you made as well, is once manufacturers are running their deals, Amazon's going to play the same game that brick and mortar retailers have, which is, for example, I was looking at a lightning deal for some Kimberly-Clark products a few weeks ago. And when I clicked into the detail page, there was a headline banner for one of Amazon's branded products, to compare the price. And so it's even more in your face than it might have been in a brick and mortar setting where you can kind of focus it on the brand at the shelf and you might be distracted by the tag or not. But in e-commerce and online, we're very accustomed to looking at those banners and seeing what else is being advertised. So it does represent that kind of second threat given the access to data and understanding of what the promotional plans are.
Right. That's an interesting point comparing it to brick and mortar retail, because if you shop at a Target, etc., you kind of know what the in-house private label brands are and they keep the same name. But with Amazon, they have at this point 10, 20 different private label brands that they do a pretty good job of concealing the fact that it's actually Amazon. And to your point, in some cases, strategically using the Amazon brand, which is not just a platform anymore, it's a brand in and of itself to actually get more trust.
And then also, the other thing to keep in mind is with the acquisition of Whole Foods, the Whole Foods 365 everyday value brand has clearly very quickly become an important anchor in the Amazon house brand strategy. So we're seeing some of their food brands like Wickedly Prime and Happy Belly be discontinued with a shift to the 365 everyday value brand. We saw those 365 products up on Amazon within days of the announcement, which to any vendor was mind-blowing because we've never seen Amazon move that fast in the vendor community. But when it came to the Whole Foods acquisition, they were moved at lightning speed to start getting Whole Foods products up on their site. So that 365 everyday value brand is going to be an additional threat now that it's, being powered by the Amazon machine.
Right. And so talking about threats, what are some of the threats that brands face in this current scenario where Amazon is launching new private label brands? They're doubling down, like you said, that in some cases they're advertising aggressively on their own platform. Obviously, they have, since they run the whole algorithm of where products show up on the product search page, they could, in theory, game that system for themselves, which is within their rights to do. It is their platform. But yeah, so what do you see as the big threats for national brands?
So, there's a key insight behind all of this, which is Amazon's operating model forever has been to watch what works and then replicate it. So we can go back to when Toys R Us used to sell on Amazon. Amazon learned everything there was to know about toys, and we're a few years later watching Toys R Us go out of business. And they've done that again and again. In apparel in particular is probably the latest one.
Yep.
So now what we're seeing is their version of what we've called e-commerce native brands or online only brands, where there's been a huge surge of brands that have popped up. They exist only online. Some of them are Amazon only brands. And Amazon has been watching this dynamic and watching these brands crush legacy manufacturers and watching the historical CPGs try and figure out, how do I compete with these online only brands that don't have the same constraints or restrictions and have been built from the bottom up to sell online? Amazon now has visibility to all of that, and they've said, well, we can play the same game. They then also have access to all of the sales, all of the velocity, and then don't forget about the reviews and Q&A where consumers and shoppers are giving feedback on what's good and bad about products. They can take all of that in and then bring these products to market using that model or better with even better insight and data. So that's probably the number one threat here is that Amazon, if they're fully taking advantage of all the data that's available to them, can take everything they've learned from legacy manufacturers, everything they've learned from e-commerce native brands, and take it to the next level with the full power of the Amazon flywheel.
Right. Yeah. All of the sales information and what people end up buying once they've viewed a product detail page. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a swag of information that they're keeping to themselves essentially and not sharing with manufacturers. So moving into kind of solution mode here, obviously branded manufacturers don't really have a choice but to be on Amazon, in my opinion. They're just losing so much potential by not being on Amazon. It's where people want to shop. So they would just be doing themselves and their customers a huge disservice by not actively engaging with Amazon. But knowing that threat is out there, what could these brands do to protect themselves or innovate? What are the solutions here?
Yeah. So you raised an interesting point there. At the very extreme end, there are a segment of brands that aren't participating with Amazon and have, very vocally said they won't. And those are the super high-end prestige brands. And you can actually look at that and say, actually, that makes sense. Their brand is so valuable, so high-end that it really does exceed any benefit of being on Amazon, and keeping that exclusivity works. And that's what I think other manufacturers who do need to participate with Amazon, which is, the other 99% of the world of manufacturers, can learn from, which is, how do I make my brand as strong as possible, as trusted as possible, and then make sure that comes across through your content and through the information you're conveying on the page, as well as, the overall broader communication strategies that most national brands would have through, national advertising and television, radio, whatever they do to build their brand equity. If you think about a brand like Pampers, or, that has very, very strong sort of iconic equity, or Johnson's baby shampoo, you've got to really think about, how do I keep that equity, keep building that equity, and make that a more trustworthy brand where, I could try the Amazon diapers brand, but I know that I can trust Pampers, or I can trust Huggies. And that, those are brands that I grew up with myself and I trust. And you go to the product detail page and read about them, and it's rich with content and educational information and comparative information. And, that becomes the critical piece to how you compete with private label. It's true in brick and mortar, and it's true as ever when it comes to Amazon. There's also the search algorithm game that's just critical to play here, which is, we've seen some very powerful brands that just don't show up very high on search results in certain categories. And so, you might do a search for certain, like you think about the Instapot, right? Pressure cookers have been around forever, but Instapot has just totally taken that over, because they've really maximized that listing, stayed at the top of search results, continued to bring a great product to market, and innovate and iterate on it over time. And manufacturers need to think the same thing. You might have the power of a national brand, and you think that that's enough versus these one-off brands that nobody's ever heard of. But if you're not number 1 or 2 or 3 in search, most customers or shoppers aren't going to get to it and even see that those are there. So really understanding how to optimize the Amazon search algorithm is every bit as important to your brand equity and driving sales both on Amazon and off, because of how much research is being done there. So, that's really where brands need to focus.
It's such a good point. And some of these, as you mentioned, digitally native brands on Amazon are really cleaning up, because they can see that the national brands don't want to engage on Amazon. They're there because they have to be, or worse, they're there because their resellers and distributors are actually putting their products up on Amazon and representing them however effectively that may be. And so they're cleaning up, because the national brands have chosen to not engage, thinking that they're, resisting Amazon or whatever the thought process is. The fact of the matter is, often those products are on Amazon, and worse, that the brand doesn't actually have control over the listing, the customer experience, the price, all these factors. Things are spiraling out of control without them even necessarily realizing it. And so it was an interesting point you made about branding and brand advertising. So we've got a lot of listeners to this show who are smaller brands or mid-sized brands, maybe without such extensive ad budgets as the Fortune 500 brands. What could they be doing in this age where they find it necessary to be on Amazon? They're competing against other brands in their space and potentially Amazon's private label brands. What can they be doing to drive that awareness and brand loyalty that you mentioned?
Amazon has rolled out, a number of new capabilities that most are probably familiar with around AMS. AMS started as a very limited capability, and it was the debate was, okay, here's Amazon Media Group, multi-million-dollar media campaigns, like you said, for the Fortune 100 or Fortune 500, and those were really about brand building and brand awareness beyond just Amazon. And AMG has always sort of kept that firewall and not made it explicitly about just driving revenue. AMS, on the other side, however, has been very popular because it is directly attributable to, it can be directly attributed to sales. It's there's a pay-per-click model in there, so you can ramp up at your own budget. And what we're seeing is more of what was in the AMG wheelhouse move over onto the AMS side to give both vendors and sellers access to be able to run sponsored search, headline search, and other key placements like that. So, if you go back a year and a half or 2 years ago, Amazon didn't have sponsored search in their search results. And now, you can take that 1 or 2 spot if you're paying for it and competing for it on certain search terms. So that's a critical tool that manufacturers should make sure they really understand, test all the different angles and corners of AMS and find what works. But we're seeing huge success with that across all of our customers.
Yeah, you're speaking my language there. That's a huge part of what we do with our clients at Bobsled Marketing is the paid search side of things. And as you mentioned, particularly headline search ads, because those are definitely sort of more in that brand and product awareness part of the funnel. And yeah, we actually did a recent episode on the podcast a couple of episodes ago. We'll link up in the show notes to how to best use headline search ads, what they are and how they can help with awareness. So
great.
Yeah, glad to hear that was one of your top tips. Great. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge on this topic. I think it's really great to have a broad view of what's going on with Amazon's private label brands, what those big brands are running up against with their sales information being used to develop these private label brands. But like you mentioned, it's not really a new phenomenon. It just happens to be on Amazon.com rather than in Target or in a grocery store.
Yeah, and arguably Amazon is the leader in how to take that data and do more with it than probably any brick and mortar retailer ever has.
Right.
So yeah, it's a dynamic space. It's just one more piece that manufacturers have to contend with to take full advantage of driving revenue on Amazon.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it blew my mind a couple of years ago when I read a book about The Power of Habits by Charles Duhigg. And he talks about how Target was actually able to figure out if someone was pregnant before they even knew themselves. So I think,
that was a bit controversial.
Yeah. I think so. Well, the point is, I think the brick and mortar retailers were able to capitalize on some of that data pretty effectively. But I think it's definitely true that Amazon is first and foremost a data focused organization. They're going to just kind of blow out of the water anything that brick and mortar retailers were previously able to do.
Absolutely.
Thanks again, Danny. We'll get you back on the show again in the future for another episode.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me.
So thanks, Danny, for coming on the show. It was great to talk with you, and we hope for you to come back on the show and we can talk about a different topic. But yeah, so Julie, what did you pick up from this interview that we can pull out for our listeners?
Well, as I said before the interview, it was the threats parts that jumped out at me. And one of them being that previously, Amazon wasn't so overt about identifying themselves as a private label brand that's being sold on Amazon. But now, as they've established credibility and consumer trust, they're more overtly using their own name and their private label brands. And so that was just an interesting evolution that was pointed out. And I think it's, something I've noted, but that the way that Danny spoke of it, it was just an interesting call out to me.
Yeah, definitely. I think during the interview, when we talked about the fact that brands don't really have a chance, well, don't have an option to choose, is kind of true. That consumers are on Amazon. They're wanting to buy products on Amazon. They're wanting to reorder products on Amazon. And if, as a brand, you just make the decision that you don't want to get in the game and compete with Amazon potentially, or give them access to your data, there's two things. First of all, there's every chance that your brand is being sold on Amazon by third-party sellers, and then you're losing even more control, and Amazon still has your sales data. So that's one thing. Just because you decide that you as a brand are not going to interact directly doesn't mean that your brand is not on Amazon. And there's been very few cases, i.e. one case where Amazon has actually gone into bat for a brand and said, okay, we will manage unauthorized sellers and we won't allow anyone to sell this brand on Amazon, and that's Nike. So unless you're a brand that's bigger than Nike or more strategically important than Nike to Amazon, you don't really have any chance of getting them to protect your brand on their platform. And then the other point is that this is where consumers want to shop. There's a huge portion of the population, and it definitely skews to higher income households and households that have high disposable income. They are all shopping on Amazon. It's where they go to both try new products that they haven't tried before and then subscribe to consumable products too. So there isn't really a viable alternative to being on Amazon and facilitating that discovery of your products, the reordering experience, the very low level of risk that consumers feel about buying something on Amazon, because they know if there's an issue that it'll be sorted out, they'll be refunded or they'll get a replacement. And that just isn't the case when you're shopping elsewhere. You just don't have that A to Z guarantee. You don't have the guarantee that everything's going to be okay in the same way that at least consumers perceive Amazon to have that low level of risk when shopping.
Absolutely. And then translate that to that being the actual brand name on the product you're buying. It's just a whole other level of competition that's quite a mountain for brands to come up against.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think Amazon is not just a platform anymore. It's a brand in and of itself. And people have such high level of trust associated with Amazon that Amazon doesn't even need to conceal the fact that they're the ones behind a new private label brand. They can pretty blatantly promote it as an Amazon brand, and it has a halo effect. I'm not sure I can think of examples where a private label brand in a retailer has the same kind of cachet, except for maybe Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's did a really good job with their private label. But
and you and Danny touched on one too with the 365 everyday whole food, but you're talking a little bit more niche in terms of
and it's
the
Amazon
market
anyway.
Precisely. So they're just replicating what's worked for them now. Yeah. They're doing it with who they've acquired.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, what about yourself as a consumer? Do you have the same kind of positive associations with the private label brand in, say, a Target or another kind of retailer, or is it pretty? Do you sort of navigate towards the national brands?
I tend to navigate towards the national brands, except for Trader Joe's. It's so funny that you say that. But also recent like CPG products purchases on Amazon, I've been getting Amazon Basics. So I don't even go for it with Target necessarily. I don't know why. But yeah, I'm pretty selective about it. I tend toward the national brands.
Yeah. Well, and I think in terms of the opportunities that national brands have, one is to just recognize that the product life cycle has kind of shifted in that if you're a national brand, you come out with an innovative new product, you launch it, you might have a couple of years of selling that product before it sunsets. And now that period where you might have exclusivity over that type of product or that innovation is really shortened. Basically, if Amazon or any other third-party seller or brand sees that a product is selling well on Amazon, they can go and replicate that product and all the benefits pretty quickly. So you have a much shorter period of time as a national brand to have any kind of exclusivity over a concept before not just Amazon, but anyone else comes along and copies it. So I'm not sure what the lesson is there, but it's kind of maybe to level set your expectations around how much of a captive audience you're going to have within the first couple of years with a new product.
Yeah, I think managing of expectations, but also going to the point that I know you and I have discussed previous episodes of the podcast here. And also Danny touched on it too, is it's important to establish who you are as a brand, to establish your brand equity and your story, and to give the customer more information about what they're buying when they buy your product.
Yeah.
So while the life cycle is shorter, I think the importance of establishing your brand is even more critical.
Yeah.
Especially on Amazon, just given the number of like products out there on the market.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, thank you for coming in, giving your take on this podcast, Julie, and we'll hopefully get Danny back on the show again to talk about some other topics as well. So stay tuned for that, and make sure if you're listening to this podcast and you're enjoying it, subscribe on iTunes or wherever you listen to this podcast so that you can get notified of our next episode.